thank you very much. If I wanted to tell you about my work, I could show you this very impressive figure, which would translate into these trends over time and eventually culminate in these 4 very important bullet points. But that's not the whole story, because I could also tell you that I was having lunch with a landowner, and at the time I was working on a project regarding cover crops. And when the landowner heard cover crops, he kind of waved his hands and was changing the subject. And I said, well, since I've been working on this project, I've actually learned some things. And I mentioned some of the benefits of cover crops. I mentioned some of the studies at Iowa State and what they found. And the landowner kept just waving his hand. He's like, look, cover crops are a waste of time. It's a fad. I don't want to hear about it anymore. And he went back to his lunch. And my purpose was not to convince him at that meeting. So we were just having a lunch. But I just kind of gave a parting shot. And I said, well, part of this project is I'm meeting with farmers. And I met this 70-year-old farmer up around the Eagle Grove area. And he tried cover crops. And he said almost immediately it got rid of his erosion problem. And he actually got a second harvest based on what he planted. And the landowner looked up from his lunch. And he said, tell me more about this guy. And so the message is that stories have power. So a lot of the things that go into all of the research we do, scientific expertise, complexity, unintuitive results, they can be barriers to other audiences that don't share that expertise. But the human experience surrounding agriculture can build connections, and the stories that we have can connect us to one another. So yes, I'm Michael Dahlstrom. I'm the Associate Director of the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication at Iowa State University. And I actually study science communication. That's what I spend my time looking at, how communication moves from expert to non-expert audiences. And what I want to talk about today is, 1, how storytelling influences audiences and how storytelling intersects with science. So I'm going to give just a little bit of the background research to say what we know. But then I want to get to important decision points you have when crafting stories, and I want to get you telling stories. So yes, I only have about 35 minutes with you today, but the title of this had the word workshop in it, so I'm going to ask you to do some things. So your first task, pull out a sheet of scratch paper and take 30 seconds, and I want you to make a bulleted list of what you did yesterday. Just boom, 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 boom. Don't even think about it. Write it down. And go. Okay, pencils up. Whatever you have, we will work with that. All right, put that to the side. Just hold it for a little bit. So I want you to think about, how do you communicate about animal agriculture? When you do tell people about your work, what do? In what format do you usually use to present it? So let's talk about 3 of the common formats that people use. So 1, we have expository, which is descriptive, it's explanatory, it's where you just say, this is what we know. This is true, and it just is. I expect you to believe me because maybe my credibility, my position, but I just tell you some facts. You see this a lot in textbooks, so most science textbooks use this, but fact sheets, anytime you're just kind of telling people what's going on, that's expository. Second one is argumentative. Now you are actually justifying your claim. So it's not just you should believe this, but we know this, therefore we know this. Because of that, you should believe me that this is true. So you're actually putting together arguments and claims. You see this in journal articles, advocacy messages, anytime you're really trying to convince someone that you know what you're talking about. Narrative is the third one, and that's what we're talking about today, storytelling. This is when you place your science or your message into a story format. So these are anecdotes, these are testimonials, these are often just personal conversation. You tell people what's going on. I think stepping through these, we can use a single example to show the difference. So a lot of times when you use the restroom, you wash your hands, there's that poster on the wall that says washing your hands is the single most effective way to stop the spread of disease. Okay, that's expository. It is. Washing your hands is the most effective way. It's just telling you what it is. If it was argumentative, it would justify that. We know that germs are here. We know that washing your hands is this. As long as you do 20 seconds, then we know that washing your hands is the single most effective way. If you wanted to move to a narrative description, you would say, this is Jacob. Jacob washed his hands, and now he doesn't get sick as much as he does. He protected this person from getting sick. It brings it down to that personal experience. So same topic, you can move it through these formats, but it should be a choice of which you want to use. So let's talk about narrative. what defines a narrative? So technically, it's a temporal sequence of events, so it's over time, cause and effect linkages, things happen within them, and it's specific human-like characters that experience it. But I think we all pretty much know what a story is. So basically, in other words, it is a particular personal experience of a larger phenomenon. I'm talking about this, but here's an example of where that touched someone's life and what they experienced. There's actually quite a bit of difference between how people process expository, argumentative, and narratives. So narratives are context-dependent, whereas expository, argumentative facts are context-free. I can give you a message, I can pull a fact out, and I can move over here and put it in another message, and the fact still maintains its same meaning. A narrative gets its meaning from the entire unit. I can't rip something out of a narrative and move it elsewhere without it losing the connections and the meaning that it builds within it. The direction of generalization is also very different. So when we talk about general truths about the world, we talk about your research findings, those are these abstractions that you would hope someone would distill down and to say, well, if that's true, then what does that mean in my case? Narratives flip it completely. It starts by giving you that case. Here's what someone experienced. And you have to generalize outward to say, well, if that happened to that guy, then what are the general truths that must be in effect for that to have happened? And we even evaluate truth differently between them. Expository argumentative facts, we evaluate based on its connection to external reality. How accurate is it? How much does it align with what's true? But within stories, we look at coherence within the narrative. So it's not so much is that true out in the real world, but did that person react in the way that I would have reacted? Did that make sense? And as long as that makes sense, we tend to accept what's in the story as true. Because of this, there's actually evidence that there's two different cognitive pathways. So expository argumentative, we process it one way, but as soon as we hear a story, we process it a different way. And some of the evidence shows that narratives are more effective. They're easier to comprehend. It's just a lot easier for us to understand it. They're processed faster. So if I give one group a narrative, I give another group an argumentative format, this group over here has processed it and understands it faster than this group. It's recalled easier, so this group over here actually remembers the story. And they carry greater weight for decision making. So exemplification theory looks at when you've got statistics or a base rate or something that's factual compared to an anecdote or a story that are in conflict. And what they find is that the story has a lot of weight. So for instance, if you were on vacation and you wanted to go swim in the ocean and someone said, you know what, you're worried about shark attacks. The chance of you getting attacked on this beach, 0.01%, almost nothing. So if that's what you heard, you'd probably say, all right, yes, let's go swimming. What exemplification finds is if in that same message you say, you know what, your risk is 0.01%, go enjoy the beach. But let me introduce you to Martha over here who lost a leg and an arm in a shark attack. Now we've got that case. It's still 0.1%. It's the same risk. But people are more likely to say, you know, I'm going to go to the pool. We're not going to go in the ocean. The more of those cases in the message, the more it pulls direction that way. So these narratives have a lot of power. And this is why it's said that stories are actually the default mode of human thought. It's how we cognitively structure reality. So we can think expositorily, we can think factually and scientifically, but when we let our guard down, we slip back to narrative thinking. So when you go home and you talk to your significant other, you're probably going to say, I got a story for you today. Here's what happened. You're probably not going to jump into these abstract truths because that's not how we think unless there's a reason. So let's look at your bullet points. Look at how you structured them. Did you put them in chronologic order, which is the start of a story? I got up, I brushed my teeth, I had Cheerios, I did this, I did this, I did this. How many people put it in chronologic order? Okay. I didn't tell you to do that. You could have done anything. You could have said, I'm going to pick the most important thing I did, and that's first. And then I'm going to pick the next. There's so many different ways to structure it. But I also forced you by doing it very quickly, so you didn't really have time to think. So that basic instinct is just to start setting up your story. How many people did something else? How many people did not order it chronologically? We got a couple. Okay. So first of all, we can see the vast majority went chronologic. So someone who had your hand up, how did you structure it?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Just a laundry list of everything that came to my mind just wrote down.
Okay, so it was accessibility. Whatever came to your mind first. Sounds good? Anyone else? Did anyone make a conscious effort to say, I'm going to order it because this is most important? Or I'm going to order it because I have most fun? Yeah? So most important? So yeah, that shows if you have time and you have a reason, you can shift out of narrative thinking. But if you're pressured, that's kind of what we default to. Okay. So that's the theory. That's what we kind of know about how our minds work with stories and why they're so effective. But now we're going to put it into practice. Because one thing about communication, it's nice to know it, but you all can also do it, and you probably should. So narratives are complex communication structures. It's more complicated than me just saying, use a narrative, and then I walk off the stage, because there's so many choices. So we're going to talk about two tips that I hope you can use today. And the first one is whatever it is you want to communicate about, see what are some anecdotes or exemplars that you can pull out of that. So these make the abstract complete. You're trying to talk about these abstract ideas, but the anecdote provides a very specific case. It allows the audience to identify with the character. So it's not just we're all doing this, but here's a person that maybe is like me, and this is what they experienced, and maybe I'll experience something similar. They're attention-getting and persuasive. We talked about the cognitive benefits. But I think this last bullet is the one that makes most sense. The reason you want to communicate to someone is it has something relevant to their lives. So just show that. Just pick that to say, this is going to be relevant to you in this context, so let's show you that context. So I'll give you a quick anecdote about anecdotes. So I have worked with Women Food Ag Network for a while, and trivia, there's actually women own or co-own over 50% of the land in Iowa, and throughout the Midwest, it's similar. But most agencies and organizations kind of overlook this audience. We either try and go for men or go for everybody. So anyway, this is a group that specifically works with women landowners to see what they're interested in, what information, communication needs they have, etc. And here's some brochures we've done. But we focus test a lot of this, and one of the things that come up a lot are these neighbor stories. So we have things about cover crops, we have things about wildlife and wetlands and whatever. But we usually try and find an actual person who has done this and has an experience. So this one is about cover crops. Again, it doesn't matter what the specifics are, but this idea that we bring it down to a human level to say, here's how someone has experienced it. These are very influential in the focus groups that we have. And this is pretty small. It's not a huge undertaking. We find someone and we include the anecdote. So your next task is to take 2 minutes, and I want you to think about whatever it is that you do, whatever it is that you want to communicate to an audience, what are some of those anecdotes, exemplars that you could use? So maybe your topic has obvious ones. So for instance, the cover crop one has obvious ones. You find someone who has used it. Do you have access to real stories? We could go find someone, but maybe you don't. So maybe you need to fictionalize, and that's fine. Maybe you're talking about a scenario. Maybe you're talking about a process. If someone experiences this process, this is what it would be. How many anecdotes do you need to demonstrate your topics? Who would be the most relevant character? Do you want to show success or failure? Maybe you want to show someone doing the right thing and they have all these wonderful benefits. Or maybe you think it would be better to show someone making mistakes to see what could happen if they don't follow whatever it is you're trying to communicate. And then finally, do you want to show an extreme example or a representative one? Because a narrative, you get to pick. You could say, I'm going to show you the average. If we look at the curve, this is the experience that's right there in the middle. This is what most people would experience. Maybe you say, you know what? It's more instructive to me to pick one of the ends. This is not probably what's going to happen, but here's what could happen if you do or you do not do these things. So take 2 minutes on your little bulleted sheet of paper. Just think about what are some of the anecdotes or the exemplars that could work with whatever it is that you want to communicate about. And I'll give you a warning. At the end, I'm going to bring some people up to share. So the more you actually write down, the more prepared you'll be. All right, whatever you've got, good enough. Thank you for participating. Hold those for a moment. I'll tell you the end of my cover crop story. So the landowner looked up from his lunch and wanted to hear more about this person. And so I told him. And a year later, this landowner had decided to try cover crops and worked very well. He actually got second harvest, and he is now kind of an opinion leader within the community, telling his neighbors about, you know what, I thought this was junk, but it worked, and here's why. And so because of that story, we had that outcome. Which brings us to our second point I want you to think about, which is a story pattern of organization. So we talked about the chronologic order, but that's one step. Because you also need to organize whatever it is your anecdote or exemplar is around a challenge. So we need a specific character. Chronologic order is part of it. But drama is good. We need some confusion, some conflict or doubt to draw people through the story. So for instance, you could have a story structured as an AAA organization. A stands for and. So we've got a fact, and we've got this other fact, and we've got this other one, and we have this other one, and we have this other one. And so we are still stringing together events. We still have temporal sequence over time, but we've got this and organization. So this is very clear. It's very clear and easy for someone to follow. Is it very engaging? No, it's not. Because it's just and. So you could actually change that to ZZZ, because it puts people to sleep. So the solution, and I want to give credit to Randy Olson. I don't know if anyone knows of Randy Olson. Filmmaker. He was a tenured professor, but he gave it up so he could make documentaries. He writes a lot of books now, and this is from one of his latest books. But he says instead of this AAA organization, you need an ABT, which is an and, but, therefore. And so you've got fact, and, so you're basically setting something up. But then there's some but. And but, this leads us to some conflict, some reason. It is this but where you get your drama. It provides a reason for your characters to act. And it also provides a reason for your audience to continue listening, because they want to hear how it turns out. So you set up this conflict with the but, and then the therefore is where you figure that out. You resolve it. These can be very simple. But let's take one story that I think everybody knows. Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Classic. If you look at it, it's got and, but, therefore everywhere in this. So Goldilocks ate one bowl of porridge, but it was too hot. Therefore, she changed, and she ate another bowl of porridge. But it was too cold. Therefore, she ate the third bowl, and it was just right. Therefore, she ate it all up. So if you look at a lot of stories, even these very small children's stories, you see this structure. You set something up. Conflict, it can be a very minor conflict, but that's what causes someone to change and act. And so, if you think about the cover crop story I told, I could have said, I had lunch with a landowner, I told him about cover crops, and he adopted it. Not exciting, right? That's the and. This happened. I mean, maybe if you're into cover crops and it's important to you, might be something. But instead, I purposefully put in the and, but, therefore. So I told him about it, but he was against it. He didn't like it. I told him this. Therefore, I told him these facts. But he still didn't want it. Therefore, I told him a story. And now he's in. Therefore, he's now a cover crop user. So again, same thing. It's just thinking about that structure of how to get that drama in there, even with a sentence or two, to create that conflict, to pull it through. So now, we are right on schedule. I want you to take another 2 minutes. Look at what you wrote down the first time, and think about how you can incorporate this and, but, therefore. How can you get that but, that drama in there? So who's your main character? Is it your audience? Is it yourself who's experiencing it? Is there an obvious chronologic order? That's a start. But then finally, where's the drama? Identify the but and the resulting therefore that would make someone want to listen to your story through to its conclusion. 2 more minutes. All right. So now, it is your turn to speak, your turn to tell some stories. I do want you to think, however, you've really only spent, I gave you 2 minutes the first time, I gave you 2 minutes the second time, the 30 seconds at the beginning didn't count, that was an exercise. So you had 4 minutes to basically work on these stories. That's all it takes. Yes, you'll spend more time to polish them, but I would say come up with stories for different stakeholder audiences, for different purposes, have them developed, have them in your pocket. That way, if that communication need ever arises, boom, you can pull it right out, and you've got something meaningful. And it didn't take that long. So who is brave? Who would like to share what you've done? And what I'd like you to do is first tell us your name and who you are, who you represent, what your position is. Tell us who you would like to communicate to, and then tell us your story and why you think that's useful. So I'm looking for a hand, or we just randomly select.
Yeah, I think we'll randomly select.
Okay.
Charlie.
I get pegged.
I think it's on, right?
Is it on?
Yep.
I'm not even sure I did this right. So I'll tell you, I went off my bulleted list of items yesterday, and I'll tell a story. Doesn't have anything to do big picture with what I do, but Charlie brought us. I'm the Virginia State veterinarian. So my day yesterday consisted of waking up, getting kids ready for the school bus, moved sheep to a new pasture in the morning before I went to work, and then I got the kids on the bus with much help from my wife, and I got to work. And yesterday was my first day back at work after being out for a week, so I had a lot of things. It was hectic at work. I got home, but I still need to get home and pack in order to make it out here last night. And then our babysitter, who was supposed to pick up our kids after school, texted me and my wife and said that she was sick, so she couldn't do it. So I guess that's the but. But the babysitter was sick, so I had to go home and pack and do a bunch of other things. And the babysitter was sick, so my wife was busy too. She's a veterinarian as well. She was in the middle of appointments, said she can't do it. Can I get Charlotte to horseback riding lessons before I go to the airport? So therefore I did, and it was very tight to getting to the airport on time, but I did. So I think I've got hands, but the babysitter was sick. Therefore, I took my daughter to horseback riding lessons on time, and therefore made it to the airport.
So first of all, you turned your bulleted list into a story, which is great, and I heard a lot of and, but, therefores in there, so good job. But hopefully you can also see with your work, with your position, if you wanted to communicate, you could use that same structure to say, oh, I'm going to talk to you about this topic. Instead of staying at these general abstractions, I'll tell you a story about this patient or this animal or this something that had this experience. Good job.
Yep.
Who's next?
So someone going to raise their hand, or am I just going to pick on you?
Did anyone pick one about your specific topic, what your position is, what you would like to do toward a certain stakeholder?
So Chelsea Good, I work with Livestock Marketing Association, and I was thinking about how we've got a policy issue we're working on, and we talk about it generally, but there are specific examples, but sometimes there's, a little personal, a little bit sticky sharing the specific examples, so can I make it an example without making it about somebody, but more of the, example. It's not in theory, it's not this happened to JJ, but let's talk about, someone that this could happen to. So when you're a livestock producer, say, the livestock producer's named Fred, and he decides it's time to sell some of his cattle, he oftentimes will take those cattle to a local sale barn. And one neat thing about that for Fred is that after his cattle sale, he can pick up a good check there at the sale barn on that day. And the sale barn doesn't own those cattle. They're selling them at auction, and there are buyers. And the buyers will take those cattle, and they'll get on the road that day. And then under federal law, their check will be in the mail by the close of the next day. And that works really well usually. The sale barn gets paid by the buyer, and Fred has already been paid by the sale barn. But sometimes no check comes. Or sometimes a check comes from that buyer, and it gets run back by the bank, and it's insufficient funds. And in those situations, Fred is still able to keep his check, but the livestock auction has very limited ability to recover the funds from that buyer. They can't go and get those animals back, even though they weren't paid for under current law. And oftentimes, those animals might even be resold, say, to a feed yard. The feed yard owns the animals. They paid for it to that buyer. but the buyer is going to have a lender that's got a blanket security interest that has priority. So we think that this is a problem in the current law. We would like to see it fixed. Fred sits in a good position because he sold at auction, but that auction owner and their lender are in a poor position, an unfair position currently, and so we're working on fixing that.
Very good. And policy options are a great way to do this because you're talking about these larger laws, these larger policies that will have an impact on somebody. So if you can bring it down and show that impact, and you brought up another point, sometimes, especially if you're dealing with personal information that you don't want to use an actual individual, that's why the scenario you fictionalized or created works very well, because this is likely what someone would experience. Fred doesn't have to be real, but there's many people like Fred, and that's what he or this person would experience. Good. All right, I think we got time. Yes, we do. One more.
No willing participants, so we're just going to, here. Nope.
Oh, my goodness. I had two stories. I don't know which one I want to share. I need to stand up? Okay. So I started with my list from yesterday, but it was a condensed list. So I'll share this story. Really 3 or 4 bullets. Not as exciting as yours. But yesterday I woke up at 3:30 a.m. to be able to drink enough coffee to leave Temple, Texas, and drive to Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. So what I found, and it's just a reminder because this has happened before, you never drive to Dallas-Fort Worth Airport for a 9 a.m. flight for relaxation. However, if you awake at 3:30 in the morning and you haven't had enough coffee and you need an adrenaline rush to keep you awake to get to the airport, it is perfect timing. So that is my story, because once you find the traffic in Dallas-Fort Worth right around 8 or 9, you'll never fall asleep. That's the short story. That was a simple one.
Very good. So yes, you could have just said that you came and got to the airport, but because you encapsulated that in a story, we see you as a character. We can relate anyone that did have to get up early to come here or come anywhere. So it's that same idea. So I would like to close by saying that storytelling offers informative and persuasive benefits for communicators. So think about any time you need to communicate. Don't just default to that general truths and abstractions and research about the world. Those are important. Those are very important. But don't just default to those, because you could also say, yes, we've got this, but here's how it impacts your life or someone like you or an individual, to show where it connects to human experience. And like I said, you spent 4 minutes and you guys came up with some. If you take an hour over the next couple weeks, you can really come up with a lot of these. And you can have different ones for different stakeholders. You can have different reasons for doing them, but they're prepped and they're ready and they're very important. So next time, instead of thinking about the general abstractions, think about stories. Or in other words, instead of defaulting to this, you need to find the story hidden in your research. That took a while, thank you. Thank you very much.